Hello, and welcome to Stories from India, a podcast where we talk about myths, legends, and folk tales from India. I am your host, Narad Muni, and I'm a mythological character myself. I have the gift of eternal life and knowledge of the past, the present, and the future. By profession, I'm a traveling musician and a storyteller. So, the way I'm doing my job is by podcast. In this episode, we will conclude the story of Angulimala, the ruthless bandit who collected fingers from his victims. All because his professor asked him to. If you haven't heard the last three episodes, it might be a good idea to do that. Here's a short summary anyway. Angulimala's dad, a priest and an astrologer, had predicted that his baby boy would grow up to be a terror. And not in the cute, affectionate way that some parents refer to their naughty children. Throughout his childhood, Angulimala's parents applied tiny nudges, hoping to steer the boy away from a life of crime. Being academically gifted, he got to go to the best university, Takshashila, the Harvard or Cambridge or Oxford of the ancient world. Angulimala did really well there, but his jealous classmates put him in a difficult spot by tricking their professor into punishing the boy for nothing at all. So instead of charging tuition fees like he did for everyone else, the professor asked Angulimala to bring him 1,000 fingers instead. Angulimala tried, but no one would willingly donate fingers. So he took them by force. He didn't have to take their lives, but he did. And he didn't spare anyone, even children. Parents are generally very supportive of their children when those children start a rock collection, or a stamp collection, or a coin collection. But most parents would draw the line at a finger collection, especially when the means of collecting those fingers were so violent. Angulimala's mother, Mantani, believed that there was still some good in her boy. Even though every single day the obituary column in the newspaper was full of all of her son's victims. So she set out to meet her son. We'll continue the story right after the two have met. Angulimala was just one finger short of his goal of 1,000. And he had decided that the final finger would come from his own mother. It's not that he didn't recognize Mantani. He just didn't care. He had been consumed by rage, violence, hatred, jealousy. He raised his knife and advanced menacingly. Mantani began to curse herself. She deserved this, she thought. Why couldn't she have just stayed home safe? She had been thinking that by bribing him with his favorite dessert, she might evoke the good that she believed was still within him. Mantani grimaced and braced herself for the death blow. The death blow at the hands of her own son. That was coming. Any minute now. Still waiting. Carefully, she peeked out from the corner of her eyes, wondering if maybe the boy had already done the deed and she was in heaven. or maybe hell. But surprise, surprise, Angulimala had not actually attacked her. In fact, he was running away. It was hard to believe that despite being the one holding the weapon, Angulimala was running away from a frail old woman. But soon, it became clear why. A third person had entered the scene. Choosing to fight him instead of his own mother, Angulimala was rushing towards this unknown gentleman in orange robes like a monk. Mantani could almost swear she saw a halo around the monk's head. Angulimala was running towards the monk in the orange robes. Even though the monk was only walking, Angulimala was unable to catch up with him. "Stop!" he gasped, exhausted from all the running. Had the ground turned into a treadmill? The monk turned around and faced him. "Stop what, my child?" he asked. He had such a soothing tone in his voice that it seemed to calm Angulimala down a bit. And yet, he mustered up some rage to shout back, "Stop moving away so fast! Can't you see I'm trying to rob you? Are you wearing roller skates under those robes?" Just then, as if in answer to Angulimala's question, a lucky breeze exposed the monk's feet beneath the long orange robes. There were no roller skates, or a skateboard, or a hoverboard. Oblivious to Angulimala's surprise, the monk replied, "I'm not the one who's moving, child. You are." Both literally and figuratively, he added, when Angulimala looked at him quizzically. "How figuratively?" asked Angulimala. "Your mind is in a constant struggle. All those emotions. Desire, which leads to attachment. Attachment leads to grief. Grief leads to fear. Fear leads to hate, and hate leads to suffering. If you realize this, you have a path to being at peace with yourself." Angulimala processed this for a while and finally said, "You know, at Takshashila, my master Yodha said something similar. But I think he left out some links in that chain. I liked your explanation so much better, and it has calmed me. I don't want to collect fingers. I don't want to hurt anyone anymore. I want to learn more. Can I come with you?" "Of course," said the monk. "But you must become a monk, like my other disciples." This whole interaction may seem like a deus ex machina moment in the story, just to prevent him from finishing his collection. But that was exactly what it was. Because the monk was really the Buddha himself. The Buddha offered Angulimala orange monk robes, which the bandit gladly accepted. Angulimala asked if he'd be getting that cool halo around his head as well. Seriously, how did he do that? Was it like a special floating light with some trick wires or something? Then, the Buddha had to remind him about what he had just said about desire and attachment leading to all those other things. Angulimala quickly apologized and promised to try harder. And after that, he did try much harder. He attended to the tasks at the monastery with great diligence, being courteous and helpful to others, and hanging on to the Buddha's every word. A few days passed. The change in Angulimala was dramatic. One day, the king showed up at the monastery. He was there to consult with the Buddha. As the king and the Buddha were strolling through the monastery gardens, the king explained what he had in mind. He was finally going to react to his subjects' pleas. They had been petitioning him for several years now to rid their forests of the monster Angulimala. So far, the bandit had beaten them 999 times to 0. But this time, the king had his most elite army, and they were sure they would win. Some of his soldiers would die, but that was a sacrifice the king was willing to make. The Buddha said to the king, "Let's talk to that guy." And he pointed out a monk who was nearby, watering plants. When he introduced the monk to the king was surprised. "Is your name Angulimala too? I recommend changing it. Even if your parents had the best of intentions when they named you that, it's an extremely unpopular name in the kingdom right now. Obviously, you're nothing like the other Angulimala, the monster in the forest, but people may still get confused." Angulimala calmly replied that he had been the monster in the forest. He was that villainous guy. Now that he had had the benefit of the Buddha's teachings, he had seen the error of his ways. And he hadn't just become a monk to escape punishment. He fully accepted responsibility for the atrocities he had committed, and he would willingly accept any punishment the king decided to give him. The king was shocked and took a while to even believe that this gentle person standing before him was number one on India's most wanted list. This guy wouldn't even hurt a fly. Marveling at the Buddha's powers of influence, the king decided a punishment would not be necessary anymore. The problem that the king was trying to solve with the vast resources of his army had been solved by just a few words from the Buddha. Angulimala lived on at the monastery, applying himself to learning from the Buddha and spreading his knowledge to others. He did not get a cool halo of his own yet, but on passing his freshman year tests, he did get a cool silver pet rabbit, whom he called R2D2. He was still not fully at peace with himself, as one might expect. But there was some improvement in that regard. It happened one day when Angulimala and the Buddha were out for an evening stroll in the forest. Angulimala was actually not sure why they were walking here. Maybe it was just a light form of physical exercise. Or maybe there were other bandits in the forest who were waiting to be converted. They heard someone crying out in pain. When Angulimala and the Buddha reached the scene, they saw two women. One of them was in labor and in great pain. The other was trying to comfort her. She immediately asked Angulimala and the Buddha to help, to do something to ease the pain. They were monks, weren't they? They probably had some kind of powers. Angulimala had no idea how to deal with this. The mantra that the Buddha had told him about attachment and grief and so on did not apply here, obviously. He was still wondering when the Buddha turned towards him and asked him, "Brother, can you ease her pain? All you have to do is to bless her and speak a powerful truth." "Like a fact?" asked Angulimala. "Like garden snails have 14,000 teeth?" "No, brother," said the Buddha. "A deep truth about yourself." This presented a problem. Angulimala could easily admit something from his past life, but it was hard to put a positive spin on any of that. Ultimately, he gently touched the pregnant lady's forehead and said, "Since my rebirth, I have not brought anyone any grief. If what I say is the truth, may this ease your suffering." What he referred to as his rebirth was his transformation by the Buddha. It worked. Soon, the lady experienced a pain free childbirth. She insisted that Angulimala bless her newborn twins. She decided to call them Luke and Leia. Angulimala did bless them, even if a bit reluctantly. But he had come to terms with himself. He was more at peace with himself now, given how his actions had helped the pregnant lady and probably saved her life and her children's lives. He began to apply himself even harder to public service. Once, when he was on a mission to spread the Buddha's teachings in a town, he was recognized by one of his survivors back from his bandit life. The word quickly spread across town. Many people who had not been able to accept the king's verdict that Angulimala was no longer a threat assumed the worst. They thought Angulimala had expanded his operations outside forests and that he had come disguised as a monk to attack them. Well, not if they attacked him first. And so they did. He did not resist even a tiny bit when the mob descended on him. His last thoughts were simply that this mob was exactly the example of people who needed to hear the Buddha. A few notes on the show. Angulimala's story is one of the best examples of the Buddha's powers of influence. The Buddha was not primarily a miracle worker. He had a way with words and with explaining things in a way that made absolute sense to anyone who listened. The Jatak tales are a great example of this. We have covered them before in previous episodes. Check out the links in the website, in the show notes section. Some people include the Buddha as one of Vishnu's avatars. Others believe it was Balram and not the Buddha. Well, speaking from first hand knowledge, I can say that it's both of them. And not just them, Vishnu has many other avatars, way more than just 10, and with more to come. I have been drawing comparisons with Star Wars throughout this story, and the similarities are not a coincidence. The Jedi Order in the Star Wars universe teaches a similar philosophy to the attachment grief chain that the Buddha described. If you think about it, it actually contradicts the Jedi role as an elite special forces unit. Angulimala most closely resembles Darth Vader. There were terrible prophecies about both, and despite that, both were raised by their family. Both left their homes at an early age to go to a very special place for education. Both found the education process challenging and conflicting, being asked to do one thing while being taught another. Both could be seen as then reacting to that conflict by adopting an extreme worldview with an utter disregard for human life. They both almost hurt the one person who believed, despite mountains of evidence to the contrary, that there was still good in them. Both transformed when presented by someone who understood the path back from the dark side to the light. And ultimately, both lives were ended after they were finally at peace with themselves. That's all for this time. In the next episode, we are back into the Ramayana. We'll see how to handle a proposal and what happens if you offend someone who has an extremely powerful brother. Spoiler alert, it will not end well for most of the people involved. If you have comments or suggestions, or if there are particular stories you'd like to hear, please do let me know by leaving a comment or a review on the site sfipodcast.com or tweet at sfipodcast. You can also find me on Instagram and Facebook. Be sure to subscribe to the show to get notified automatically of new episodes. Thanks to all of you listeners for your continued support and your feedback. The music is from purpleplanet.com. That's purple-planet.com. I'll see you next time.